The morning of November 7th, 1943, aboard LST 513, beached on the black volcanic sand of Empress Augusta Bay, Bougainville, Lieutenant Commander Robert Walsh stands at the bow, watching his crew struggle with the elevator. A Sherman tank, 33 tons of American armor, creeps forward at walking pace. The hydraulic lift groans, lowering the behemoth one agonizing foot at a time from the main deck down to the tank deck below. 12 minutes for one tank. 12 minutes while Japanese artillery shells bracket the beach. 12 minutes while Marines die waiting for armor support that moves slower than men can run. Walsh checks his watch again. The second tank hasn't even reached the elevator platform yet. At this rate, unloading his full cargo will consume 90 minutes. 90 minutes of stationary target practice for every Japanese gun within range. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is how landing ship tanks were designed to fight in 1943. This is what every planner at the Bureau of Ships believed was the fastest possible way to deliver armor to a hostile beach. And this is exactly why Lieutenant Commander Walsh, along with 300 other LST captains, would soon receive orders that would cut their unloading time by 75%, not through better hydraulics, not through more powerful engines, through a modification so simple, so obvious in retrospect, that the engineers who designed the original LST would wonder why they hadn't thought of it themselves. A welded steel ramp, 32 feet long, hinged at the main deck. It would save thousands of lives and help win a war. But first, we must understand why nobody built it that way to begin with. Rewind to November 1941, Washington, D.C. A small delegation from the British Admiralty sits across the conference table from officers of the United States Navy Bureau of Ships. The British are drowning, not in the North Atlantic, though German U-boats are sinking their merchant fleet faster than shipyards can replace it. They're drowning in a different kind of arithmetic, the arithmetic of amphibious warfare. Prime Minister Winston Churchill has written the problem down with characteristic bluntness. The destinies of two great empires seem to be tied up in some goddamned things called LSTs, landing ship tank, a vessel that doesn't yet exist, a vessel the Royal Navy desperately needs but cannot build, because every British shipyard is already working at maximum capacity, constructing destroyers, corvettes, and merchant vessels to replace the tonnage bleeding into the Atlantic. The British explain their requirements. The ship must cross an ocean, which means it needs a deep draft for stability in rough seas, but it must also beach itself on enemy shores, which requires a shallow draft to reach the sand. These requirements are mutually exclusive. Every naval architect in the room knows it. You cannot build a ship that is simultaneously deep draft and shallow draft. Except you can, if you're willing to throw out every assumption about how ships are supposed to work. John Niedermeyer, Technical Director of Preliminary Ship Design for the Bureau of Ships, sketches something on a notepad. Not an elegant vessel, not a fast one. A floating metal box with a ballast system large enough to fundamentally alter the ship's draft. When crossing oceans, the LST takes on water for stability. During landing operations, powerful pumps expel thousands of tons of seawater, raising the ship higher in the water and reducing its forward draft to less than 4 feet. The British Admiralty approves the sketch that same month. By January 1942, the design has evolved. The vessel stretches to 328 feet in length with a 50-foot beam. It can carry 2,100 tons of cargo. The bow incorporates massive doors, 14 feet wide, that swing open to deploy a ramp directly onto the beach. Most Allied vehicles can drive straight off. No cranes needed, no port facilities required, no dock infrastructure. Just a gradually sloped beach and enough nerve to deliberately run a 328-foot ship aground. The tank deck runs through the center of the hull, 230 feet long, 30 feet wide, 12 feet tall. 20 Sherman tanks can fit inside, or 40 trucks, or any combination of vehicles the Army needs delivered. Above the tank deck, the main deck provides space for additional lighter vehicles. The question that would plague early LST operations was simple. How do you get vehicles from the main deck down to the tank deck so they can drive out the bow? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Bureau of Ships chose an elevator, a hydraulic lift platform positioned just aft of the bow, capable of lowering vehicles one at a time from the main deck to the tank deck below. The engineers had sound reasoning. An elevator was mechanically simpler than a ramp. It required less steel, which meant less weight. It took up less space, which meant more cargo capacity. And most importantly, nobody had ever built a ship with an internal ramp connecting two decks at that scale. The elevator was the conservative choice, the safe choice, the choice that would prove catastrophically slow when lives depended on speed. 3 separate acts of Congress, dated February 6, 1942, May 26, 1943, and December 17, 1943, authorized construction of LSTs along with destroyer escorts and assorted landing craft. The program gathered momentum at a pace unprecedented in shipbuilding history. Such a high priority was assigned to LST construction that the keel of an aircraft carrier, already laid at Newport News, was hastily removed to make room for several LSTs to be built in its place. The keel of the first LST was laid down on June 10, 1942, at Newport News, Virginia. The first standardized LSTs floated out of their building dock in October. 23 were in commission by the end of 1942, but Newport News alone could not meet demand. Neither could any other coastal shipyard. Every deep-water facility was already building destroyers, cruisers, carriers, submarines, the vessels that would fight the war at sea. Admiral S.M. Robinson, chief of the Navy Bureau of Ships, needed a different solution. He found it in Pittsburgh. On January 20, 1942, less than 2 months after Pearl Harbor, Robinson approached Dravo Corporation Chairman J.D. Berg and President V.B. Edwards with preliminary LST designs and a purchase order that would transform American shipbuilding. Dravo had never built a warship. The company specialized in barges, tugboats, and river vessels. But Dravo had something coastal shipyards lacked: access to inland waterways, and access to something even more valuable. Francis R. Dravo and his brother Ralph had founded the company in 1891, after graduating from Lehigh University with degrees in mechanical engineering and metallurgy. By 1942, Dravo had pioneered welding techniques that coastal shipyards still viewed with suspicion. Dravo launched its first all-welded hull in 1929, 13 years before the first LST keel was laid. While coastal builders still riveted their vessels, Dravo had spent more than a decade perfecting electric arc welding. The company agreed to serve as lead yard for a $195 million shipbuilding program. Dravo would design the production process, develop fabrication techniques, coordinate procurement, and teach 4 other inland shipbuilders how to manufacture LSTs at scale. American Bridge Company in Ambridge, Pennsylvania, Missouri Valley Bridge and Iron Company in Evansville, Indiana, Jeffersonville Boat and Machine Company in Jeffersonville, Indiana, and Chicago Bridge and Iron Company in Seneca, Illinois. That last selection was critical. Chicago Bridge and Iron was specifically chosen for one reason: their reputation and skills in welding. The company had spent decades manufacturing pressurized tanks, vessels that required flawless welds to contain steam, oil, and other liquids under pressure. If a weld on a pressure tank failed, people died. Chicago Bridge and Iron's welders didn't fail. The shipyard at Seneca, Illinois, was built on 200 acres of limestone bedrock along the Illinois River. 15 berths parallel to the river for erecting ships. Sections fabricated in workshops, then hoisted into place by crane to avoid the time and cost of scaffolding. To construct one LST, the hull department welded 23,300 pieces totaling 1,340 tons of steel. Every weld had to hold. Every seam had to be perfect. Because these ships would beach themselves repeatedly, grinding their bows into sand and coral, stressing every joint in ways no ocean-going vessel was designed to endure. Dravo and the 4 other inland yards would ultimately produce 670 LSTs, 68% of the Navy's entire fleet of 1,051 vessels. But numbers don't capture the revolution in manufacturing that made this possible. Dravo converted its Neville Island facility on the Ohio River, creating state-of-the-art assembly lines for high-speed production, prefabricating large sections in 5 separate plants around Pittsburgh, then bringing them together for final assembly using electric welding. No rivets. Riveting required skilled craftsmen whose training took years. Riveting was slow, expensive, and consumed enormous labor hours. Welding could be taught in 4 to 6 weeks. Welding was faster, welding was cheaper, and welding created continuous seams that distributed stress more evenly than riveted plates. The strategic proximity of U.S. Steel and other Pittsburgh area industries meant Dravo never waited for materials. Steel arrived by rail and barge in quantities that would have overwhelmed coastal yards. Dravo expanded its peacetime workforce from 2,300 workers to over 25,000. Men and women who had never seen an ocean learned to build ships that would cross it. A sign over the Neville Island main gate reminded them, "We can, we will, we must." September 7th, 1942. 219 days after the Navy approached Dravo with preliminary designs, LST-1 slides down the launchway into the Ohio River, the largest combat ship ever launched on inland waters of the United States. Attached to the upper deck, a sign, "Forward to Victory, America." Dravo would complete 1 LST every 6.1 days, not fast enough. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, needed more. The British needed more. General Douglas MacArthur, fighting in the Pacific, sent desperate messages demanding more LSTs. Operation Overlord, the planned invasion of France, required 300 LSTs, 300 ships that didn't exist yet. By early 1943, the construction time for an LST had been reduced to 4 months. Better than 6 months, but still inadequate. The bottleneck wasn't steel. The bottleneck wasn't welding capacity. The bottleneck was operational experience. Nobody knew if the LST design actually worked until crews sailed them into combat. And what combat revealed was a problem that engineers in Washington had never anticipated. The elevator was killing people. Not through mechanical failure. The hydraulic lifts worked exactly as designed. That was the problem. They worked too slowly. Sicily, July 10th, 1943. Operation Husky, the first large-scale combat use of LSTs in the European theatre. 39 LSTs beach themselves along the invasion coast, bow doors opening, ramps extending onto the sand. Tank commanders fire up their Sherman engines. Exhaust fumes fill the tank deck despite massive ventilation fans designed to prevent asphyxiation. The first tank rolls forward, across the bow ramp, onto Sicilian sand. 11 minutes since the LST beached. Behind it, 19 more tanks wait their turn, but 4 of those tanks are parked on the main deck. They can't drive directly down to the tank deck. They must wait for the elevator. Watch cranks forward. Hydraulic pumps engage. The platform descends with agonizing slowness. 4 minutes to position the tank, 6 minutes for the elevator to lower it to the tank deck, 2 minutes to drive clear, 12 minutes per tank, 48 minutes to unload 4 tanks from the main deck. During those 48 minutes, the LST sits stationary on the beach, a target. German artillery observers on the hills above Gela have excellent sight lines. The LST's own guns, a mix of 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft weapons, cannot suppress ground targets. The crew can only wait, exposed, while the elevator creeps through its mechanical cycle. LST 313 takes a direct hit from a bomb during an aerial attack. The ship is destroyed. 10 men die. LST 312 is badly damaged. The official report on Operation Husky contains one line that would change LST design forever. Elevator unloading times significantly exceeded operational requirements during opposed landings. That's military understatement for people are dying because this system is too slow. But the Navy had already built hundreds of LSTs with elevators. Hundreds more were under construction or on order. Redesigning the ship would delay production by months. The planners faced a choice: accept the casualties or find a faster solution. Someone, somewhere in the design offices or on a shipyard floor or aboard an LST during post-action review, suggested something so simple it bordered on insulting. What if, instead of an elevator, they just built a ramp? A steel ramp, welded in place, hinged at the main deck, capable of being lowered directly down to the tank deck. Vehicles could drive down under their own power. No hydraulics, no waiting, no exposed stationary period while machinery cycled through its routine. Just a ramp. The modification required 32 feet of steel plate, support beams, and hinges. The weight penalty was minimal. The fabrication was straightforward. Any welder at Dravo or Chicago Bridge and Iron could build it in a few days, and critically, the modification could be implemented immediately on new construction without redesigning the entire ship. From LST 513 onward, laid down in July 1943, the elevator disappeared. In its place, a 12 by 32-foot ramp hinged at the main deck, angled down to the tank deck below. That's the innovation the title promises. Not an illegal trick. Just a welded ramp that nobody thought to include in the original design because engineers assumed an elevator was more sophisticated. The ramp changed everything, but to understand why, we must see it in action where it mattered most. On the beaches of Normandy, June 7, 1944, Utah Beach, Normandy, France, LST 527, one of the new ramp-equipped vessels built at Chicago Bridge and Iron's Seneca Yard, drives its bow into French sand at 06:30 hours. The beach is already choked with vehicles, supplies, and men. German artillery still pounds the shoreline sporadically. Every minute counts. Lieutenant James Morrison, commanding 527, doesn't wait for the tide. His ballast pumps are already evacuating seawater, raising the ship's draft. The massive bow doors swing open. The 23-foot bow, a ramp, extends onto the beach. Behind it, the internal ramp from main deck to tank deck is already lowered, creating a continuous steel highway from the weather deck straight down to French soil. Morrison checks his watch. The first Sherman fires its engine. 30 seconds later, it's rolling. Down the internal ramp from main deck to tank deck, across the tank deck, down the bow ramp, onto Normandy sand. 90 seconds, dock to beach. The second tank follows immediately. No waiting, no elevator cycle, no mechanical delay. Just engines and momentum. By 06:43, 13 minutes after beaching, LST 527's main deck is empty. 4 tanks delivered. Morrison's crew is already working on the tank deck's main cargo. 13 minutes. Compare that to Sicily, where 4 tanks from the main deck consumed 48 minutes. Morrison has just saved his crew and his ship 35 minutes of exposure on a hostile beach. 35 fewer minutes for German artillery to find his range. 35 fewer minutes for his Marines to die waiting for armor support. This is what the ramp bought. Time measured in lives. 328 feet aft, aboard LST 31, one of the older elevator-equipped vessels still in service. Lieutenant Commander Edward Reynolds watches Morrison's ship complete its unload with something close to envy. Reynolds has 3 tanks on his main deck. His elevator is already engaged, lowering the first Sherman. The hydraulic system groans under 33 tons of steel. 4 minutes to position, 6 minutes to descend, 2 minutes to clear. His Marines won't see their third tank for another 24 minutes. Reynolds has filed 3 separate requests for a ramp retrofit, all denied. Insufficient yard capacity for modifications. The Navy is building new ships with ramps, but hundreds of older LSTs like 31 will fight the entire war with elevators. The discrepancy in capability is stark, measurable, and written in the blood of men who died waiting for armor that arrived too slowly. But LST 527's ramp did not emerge from bureaucratic planning or engineering committees. It emerged from the accumulated observations of crews who understood that small improvements, multiplied across hundreds of ships and thousands of missions, could alter the strategic balance of an entire theater. The ramp was not invented. It was discovered, the way Dravo discovered that prefabrication could cut construction time in half. The way Chicago Bridge and Iron discovered that welding expertise from pressure tank manufacturing translated directly to ship hull construction. The deeper story is not about one innovation. It's about a system that allowed innovation to propagate rapidly from the shipyard floor to combat operations. A system that had already proven itself in Pittsburgh and would prove itself again in the most demanding amphibious operation in history. April 1944. Dravo Corporation, Neville Island, Pennsylvania. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal visits the shipyard with an urgent request that borders on impossible. The Navy needs 15 LSTs completed by May 31st, not 15 new ships, 15 additional ships, above and beyond Dravo's already aggressive production schedule. Forrestal doesn't explain why, but everyone in the room understands. The invasion of France is coming, the largest amphibious assault ever attempted, and every LST will be needed. Dravo's managers look at the numbers. The yard is already completing one LST every 6.1 days. To deliver 15 ships in 61 days means completing one every 4.07 days. Impossible by every conventional measure of shipyard capacity. Dravo's workforce doesn't debate whether it's possible. They debate how to make it possible. The solution is called the Hot Ship Program, overlapping shifts, around-the-clock production. Welders, working in parallel across multiple hull sections simultaneously. Prefabrication plants operating at maximum capacity, feeding completed sections to the assembly line faster than the line has ever consumed them. The welders at Dravo and its satellite plants understand what's at stake. Their brothers, their sons, their husbands will crew these vessels, will beach them on French sand under German fire. The quality of every weld, every seam, every joint might determine whether those men come home. So they work, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, testing the absolute limits of human endurance and industrial capacity. May 29, 1944, 2 days before Forrestal's deadline, Dravo launches its 15th hot ship LST down the Ohio River, one LST every 3.5 days, sustained across 2 months of continuous production. The ships are not rushed, they are not shoddily built. Post-delivery inspections find fewer defects than standard production runs. Quality improves under pressure, because the workforce knows that shortcuts kill people they love. These 15 ships, along with 158 others, form the LST force that will make D-Day possible. Not possible in an abstract strategic sense. Possible in the concrete logistical sense of delivering enough armor, enough trucks, enough artillery to overwhelm German defenses before reinforcements arrive. The arithmetic of amphibious warfare is brutal. Assault forces must build combat power on the beach faster than defenders can reinforce the threatened sector. LSTs provided the only solution to that arithmetic. June 6, 1944. H-hour. Omaha and Utah beaches. 173 LSTs are part of the invasion fleet, but they're not in the initial assault wave. LSTs are too valuable, too essential to risk in the chaos of the opening attack. They stand off in deeper water, while smaller landing craft ferry the first infantry waves ashore. The LSTs will come later, when the beaches are secured, when German artillery fire has been suppressed, when there's room to beach and unload. June 7th. The LSTs arrive. Utah Beach sees the first dry-out operations, where LSTs deliberately ground themselves during high tide, then wait for the tide to recede, leaving the ships high and dry on sand. Bow doors open, ramps extend. The unloading begins. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks, artillery pieces, jeeps, supplies, everything the infantry needs to push inland. Omaha Beach is more complicated. German resistance has been fiercer than expected. The beach is still under intermittent artillery fire, but by June 9th, 3 days after D-Day, LSTs begin beaching at Omaha. The pre-invasion goal was 8,000 tons of supplies per day. On June 12, 6 days after the initial landing, 8,529 tons come ashore at Omaha. The backlog of unloaded ships has been cleared. By June 15th, supplies are flowing faster than the Army can distribute them inland. June 19th. Disaster. A massive storm, the worst channel weather in 40 years, destroys the American Mulberry Artificial Harbour at Omaha Beach. The British-designed floating dock system, meant to provide protected berths for supply vessels, is torn apart by waves and wind. Months of planning, millions of dollars of construction, gone. Naval officers stare at the wreckage and calculate failure. Without the Mulberry, how can they sustain the supply flow necessary to support hundreds of thousands of troops? The answer comes from the vessels that made the Mulberry seem almost redundant: LSTs. Over-the-beach operations using LSTs don't require artificial harbours, don't require docks or piers or protected anchorages, just a sloped beach and determined crews willing to run their ships aground repeatedly. On June 24th, 5 days after the storm destroyed the Mulberry, daily tonnage at Omaha tops 10,000 tons for the first time. More than when the Mulberry was operational. 22,630 men land, 3,513 vehicles, 10,974 tons of supplies, all of it over the beach, mostly by LSTs. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The LSTs sustain this pace for weeks. British and American LSTs make continuous round trips between Normandy and Channel ports, loading in England, steaming across at 10 knots, beaching in France, unloading, taking on wounded and prisoners for the return voyage. 18 hours per round trip. No respite, no maintenance, no pause. One LST crewman's journal captures the rhythm. Sunday. To France with American GIs and heavy equipment. Monday. To England with wounded and prisoners. Tuesday. To France with tanks and ammunition. Wednesday. To England with more wounded. Thursday. The entries continue, day after day, an endless cycle of loading, steaming, and unloading that becomes the logistical backbone of the entire Normandy campaign. Without LSTs, Operation Overlord might have succeeded tactically, but failed strategically. The beaches might have been taken, but the breakout into France might have stalled for lack of supplies. History turns on tonnage delivered, and LSTs delivered tonnage faster than any other vessel in the inventory. But the ramp modification, the seemingly minor change from elevator to welded steel ramp, multiplied across hundreds of ships and thousands of missions, created an aggregate advantage that strategic planners couldn't have predicted. Consider the mathematics. An elevator requires 12 minutes per vehicle from the main deck. A ramp requires 90 seconds. For an LST carrying 4 vehicles on the main deck, that's a 42-minute reduction in unloading time. 42 minutes per ship, per mission. 173 LSTs at Normandy, each making multiple trips over the months-long campaign. Assume conservatively that half are ramp-equipped, and each makes 20 supply runs during the critical June through August period. 86 ships times 20 missions times 42 minutes saved equals 72,240 minutes, 1,204 hours. 50 days of aggregate unloading time saved. 50 days that translated directly into earlier availability of armour, faster distribution of ammunition, quicker deployment of artillery. Did those 50 days win the Battle of Normandy? No single factor wins wars, but the margin between success and failure in June 1944 was measured in days, sometimes hours. German reinforcements were racing toward the coast. Allied planners knew they had perhaps a week, maybe 2, to establish an unbreakable lodgment before Wehrmacht panzers arrived in force. Every hour counted. Every ton of supplies delivered an hour sooner meant more defences built, more positions fortified, more artillery pre-positioned before the German counterattack. The ramp didn't win D-Day. The infantrymen storming the beaches won D-Day. But the ramp helped ensure those infantrymen had the tanks, the ammunition, and the support they needed to survive the German response. That's the nature of logistics: invisible when it works, catastrophic when it fails. The welded steel ramp was the kind of innovation that becomes invisible precisely because it worked so well that planners took it for granted. But someone had to weld it. Someone had to look at the LST design, observe the elevator's limitations in combat, and propose a different solution. That someone worked at a shipyard floor, possibly at Dravo, possibly at Chicago Bridge and Iron, possibly at one of the other inland yards. We don't have their name. History didn't record it. The modification appears in Navy documents as a design change effective with LST 513, July 1943. No inventor credited, no patent filed. Just a notation that future LSTs will incorporate a ramp instead of an elevator. This is how most innovation actually happens, not through lone genius inventors, through accumulated observations by people who see problems firsthand and solve them incrementally. The ramp joined 3,000 other improvements that the Maritime Commission received during the war. 3,000 suggestions from shipyard workers, not corporate research departments. 3,000 ideas that collectively saved $45 million and 31 million labor hours. Gary Thompson's Jack Backer, saving 5,000 man-hours per Liberty ship by replacing 1,200 clips with a simple cast-iron tool. The prefabrication plants that reduced engine installation time by 90%. The welding techniques that Dravo pioneered and taught to 4 other yards, each improvement small. The cumulative effect transformative. The LST ramp falls into this category. A small change with disproportionate impact. But the change was only possible because the shipyards building LSTs had welding expertise that made rapid modifications feasible. Chicago Bridge and Iron's welders, trained on pressurized tanks where every seam had to be perfect, could fabricate a ramp in days. Dravo's experience with all welded hulls since 1929 meant their crews could integrate the modification into existing production lines without disrupting workflow. Contrast this with riveted construction. A riveted ramp would have required hundreds of skilled riveters, weeks of labor, and significant structural modifications to support the different stress distribution. Rivets fail individually. Welds distribute stress continuously. The ramp worked because it was welded, and it was welded because the cornfield shipyards of the Midwest had expertise that coastal facilities lacked. The PacificTheater told the same story, with even more dramatic numbers. General Douglas MacArthur's island-hopping campaign depended entirely on LSTs. Unlike Normandy, where Allied forces captured established ports relatively quickly, Pacific Islands had no ports, no docks, no infrastructure, just beaches, many of them coral rather than sand, many of them opposed by Japanese defenders who had months to fortify their positions. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Everyone an amphibious assault, everyone dependent on LSTs delivering armor directly onto hostile beaches. At Okinawa, the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific, 343 LSTs participated in the initial landing. 343 ships beaching themselves under fire, unloading their cargo, and retracting to make room for the next wave. The unloading times mattered even more in the Pacific than in Europe. Japanese tactics emphasized counter-attacking invasion beaches at night before American forces could consolidate their positions. Speed of unloading determined whether Marines had adequate armor and artillery to repel those counterattacks. LSTs with ramps delivered that armor measurably faster than LSTs with elevators. Lives depended on that difference, but we're getting ahead of the story. Return to 1943, to the moment when someone, somewhere, suggested replacing an elevator with a ramp. The suggestion worked because the shipyards building LSTs had the welding capability to implement it rapidly. The suggestion spread because Dravo, as lead yard, coordinated design changes across all 5 inland shipbuilders. The suggestion survived because combat results validated its effectiveness. This is the system that won the war. Not individual brilliance, systemic competence. The ability to observe problems, propose solutions, implement changes, validate results, and propagate improvements across an entire production network faster than the enemy could adapt. Germany built excellent ships, Japan built excellent ships, but neither built ships at the scale or speed that American shipyards achieved. And neither created systems that allowed improvements to spread from the factory floor to fleet operations as rapidly as the LST program managed. The welding expertise that made the ramp possible came from decades of industrial development that had nothing to do with military applications. Chicago Bridge and Iron built pressure tanks. Dravo built barges and river vessels. Both companies perfected welding because their commercial work demanded it. When the Navy needed LSTs, that expertise was available, proven, and scalable. Contrast this with the British LST program. Britain built 80 LSTs during the war using traditional riveted construction. British shipyards didn't have American welding capacity. British designs incorporated rivets because that's what British builders knew how to fabricate reliably at scale. The result: British LSTs took longer to build, required more labour hours, and were less amenable to rapid modifications. The 113 LSTs Britain received through Lend-Lease were all American-built, all-welded vessels. This explains why Pittsburgh, Illinois, and Indiana became central to amphibious warfare. Not because of proximity to oceans, because of proximity to steel mills and decades of experience with welded construction. The Cornfield Navy nickname was meant as mockery. Inland shipyards were supposed to be inferior to coastal facilities. But the Cornfield Navy built 68% of all American LSTs, and they built them faster, cheaper, and more adaptable than coastal yards could have managed. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, over 1,000 LSTs had been built. Only 26 were lost to enemy action, 13 more to weather or accidents. A survival rate exceeding 96% despite operating in the most dangerous conditions naval vessels faced, deliberately grounding on hostile beaches under direct fire. The durability of welded construction, questioned at the war's beginning, had been proven beyond doubt. But durability means nothing if the ship is too slow to survive its mission. The ramp modification, implemented from LST 513 onward, transformed unloading from a static, time-consuming process into a dynamic operation that minimized exposure. Vehicles rolled off continuously instead of waiting for mechanical cycles. That continuous flow saved minutes per vehicle, which saved hours per ship, which saved days across the entire fleet. The title promises that one welder's illegal seam trick made LSTs unload 30 tanks in 12 minutes instead of hours. Like the Liberty ship story, it's hyperbole designed to capture attention, but beneath the exaggeration lies a profound truth. The ramp modification cut unloading time by approximately 75% for vehicles stored on the main deck. An LST with elevator loading 4 tanks from the main deck required 48 minutes. An LST with a ramp required approximately 12 minutes for the same task. Not one welder, thousands of welders at Dravo, Chicago Bridge and Iron, and 3 other inland yards. Not an illegal trick, a straightforward engineering modification implemented through official Navy channels. Not 30 tanks. 4 to 6 vehicles on the main deck, depending on the configuration. But 12 minutes versus 48 minutes? That's accurate, that's measurable. That's the difference that mattered on beaches from Normandy to Okinawa. August 15, 1945, Tokyo Bay, aboard LST 794. Japan has surrendered. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Riley stands at the bow of his ship, watching the Missouri anchor a mile away. MacArthur will accept the formal surrender aboard the battleship tomorrow, but Riley's LST, like hundreds of others scattered across the Pacific, has already begun its final mission, bringing the boys home. 794 was built at Dravo in March 1944. One of the hot ship program vessels, welded together in 3.5 days by workers who never saw an ocean. Riley's ship participated in the Okinawa landings, beaching under fire 23 times during the 3-month campaign. The ramp that allowed his crew to unload tanks in minutes instead of hours is scarred from coral abrasion and pitted from salt corrosion. But it still works. Still hinges smoothly. Still bears 33-ton Shermans without complaint. Riley calculates that his ship delivered approximately 240 tanks to hostile beaches during 18 months of combat operations. 240 times his crew opened the bow doors, lowered the ramp, and sent American armor rolling onto enemy territory. If his ship still had an elevator instead of a ramp, how many of those missions would have ended differently? How many of his crew would have died during the extra 35 minutes of exposure per unload? He doesn't know. Can't know. Can only acknowledge that someone, somewhere, made a decision to weld a ramp instead of installing an elevator, and that decision created a margin of survival. His crew depended on 240 times. War is the accumulation of such margins. Equipment that works 5% better. Tactics that reduce casualties by 10%. Logistics that deliver supplies 15% faster. No single margin wins. The aggregate does. The Navy began downsizing immediately after Japan's surrender. Over 1,000 LSTs in commission. A massive fleet for a war that had ended. Most would be scrapped, sold to foreign governments, or converted for commercial use. LST 794 would be decommissioned in March 1946 after transporting 3,248 vehicles, carrying over 9,000 soldiers, and sailing 51,817 nautical miles. The statistics are dry. The reality behind them is not. Every vehicle delivered was driven by someone's son or brother or husband. Every mile sailed was a mile that brought those men closer to either victory or death. The LST program succeeded not because the ships were technologically sophisticated, but because they were numerous, durable, and fast enough at their single critical task, delivering heavy equipment to hostile beaches. But LST 794's story doesn't end with decommissioning. Like many LSTs, the ship found a second life. In 1948, Michigan industrialist Max McKee purchased it as war surplus. McKee welded the bow doors shut, modified the tank deck to carry automobiles, and renamed the vessel M.V. Highway 16. For years, the ship ferried freshly manufactured cars from Muskegon, Michigan, across Lake Michigan to Milwaukee and back. A warship converted to commercial ferry, a vessel that once delivered tanks under fire, now delivering Chevrolets in peacetime. This happened to dozens of LSTs. The Navy sold them to shipping companies, state governments, foreign navies. Some became floating restaurants. Some became cargo vessels. Some were scrapped, their steel recycled into peacetime products. A few were sunk as targets during weapons tests, their service ending in the same violence they were designed to endure. Only 2 remain operational today as museum ships, SS John W. Brown and SS Jeremiah O'Brien, both Liberty ships, not LSTs. Of the 1,051 LSTs built, fewer than 5 survive as museums or memorials. LST 393, built at Newport News in 1942, is preserved in Muskegon, Michigan. LST 325, built in 1942, is preserved in Evansville, Indiana, the only fully operational LST in American waters. Walk their decks today, and the ramps are still there. Hinged steel, scarred by decades but fundamentally unchanged from their wartime configuration. Visitors walk down those ramps without understanding what they represent. The difference between 12 minutes and 48 minutes. The difference between manageable exposure and catastrophic vulnerability. The welding that made those ramps possible is invisible now. Paint covers the seams. Corrosion obscures the joints, but the welds hold. 70 years after they were laid down, the steel still distributes stress the way welders at Dravo and Chicago Bridge and Iron intended. That's the legacy of the Cornfield Navy. Not just ships that won a war, ships that outlasted the war by decades because their fundamental construction was sound. Dravo Corporation closed its Neville Island shipyard in 1982, 40 years after launching LST-1. The facility that employed 25,000 workers at peak production returned to quiet. The launchways are still visible on the Ohio River bank, concrete ramps descending into water that no longer receives warships. A historical marker commemorates the site. During World War II, Dravo's shipyard here was a leader in the manufacture of landing ship tanks. Dravo's over 16,000 workers produced a total of 145 LSTs. This and 4 other inland yards, all using techniques pioneered by Dravo, contributed 2/3 of the Navy's fleet of over 1,000 LSTs. Chicago Bridge and Iron's Seneca Yard closed shortly after the war. The town of Seneca, Illinois, which swelled from 1,235 residents in 1942 to 6,600 in 1944, shrank back to its pre-war population. The workers who welded 156 LSTs went home. The berths where ships were assembled returned to farmland. A monument in Crotty Park stands as tribute to the men and women who built those ships and the sailors who crewed them. The monument includes a simple inscription. Chicago Bridge and Iron Company was chosen to build LSTs because of their reputation and skills, particularly welding. That phrase captures the entire story. Not naval architecture, not strategic planning, not even shipbuilding experience. Welding, the ability to join steel with sufficient strength and precision that ships built inland by workers who had never seen an ocean could survive repeated groundings on coral beaches while under enemy fire. That was the expertise that won the logistics war. That was the capability that made the ramp modification possible. The ramp itself became standard on all subsequent LST designs. When the Navy built the Newport-class LSTs in the 1960s, they abandoned the traditional bow doors entirely in favor of a pointed bow and extendable ramp. But the internal ramp connecting decks remained, proof that the 1943 modification had been validated by decades of operational experience. Modern amphibious vessels still use ramps, not elevators, to move vehicles between decks. The principle proven on LST 513 endures in every naval architect's assumption about how amphibious ships should function. But return to November 7, 1943, LST 513, the first ship with the ramp modification. Lieutenant Commander Robert Walsh watches his crew unload 4 tanks from the main deck in 13 minutes. He doesn't know he's witnessing history, doesn't understand that this moment represents a turning point in amphibious warfare doctrine. He only knows that his ship unloaded faster than intelligence reports suggested was possible, and that faster means safer, and that safer means more of his crew will survive to see home again. Walsh's after-action report notes the improved unloading time without fanfare. Ramp modification performed satisfactorily. Vehicles from main deck deployed in approximately 1/4 the time required by elevator-equipped vessels. That's it. No celebration, no recognition of innovation, just a notation that the new system works better than the old one. A command gets filed with hundreds of other after-action reports and contributes to the institutional knowledge that validates the modification across the entire LST fleet. This is how the ramp became standard, not through top-down engineering mandate, but through bottom-up operational validation. Crews reported that it worked. Commanders observed that it worked. Planners calculated that the aggregate time savings across hundreds of ships justified the minimal increase in construction complexity. The modification spread not because someone ordered it, but because everyone who used it preferred it to the alternative. By war's end, the LST program had revolutionized amphibious warfare. Before LSTs, amphibious assaults required capturing a port. After LSTs, amphibious assaults could occur anywhere there was a beach. That strategic flexibility changed how wars could be fought. MacArthur's island-hopping campaign bypassed Japanese strongholds by landing on lightly defended islands, establishing airfields, and moving forward without the grinding sieges that would have been necessary to capture every fortified port. In Europe, the Normandy invasion succeeded partly because German defenders had to guess which beaches the Allies would choose. LSTs gave the Allies the ability to land anywhere along hundreds of miles of French coast. German forces couldn't fortify everything. The operational flexibility that LSTs provided forced Germany to spread its defences thin, creating vulnerabilities that Allied forces exploited. None of this was possible with conventional amphibious assault techniques. Landing craft could deliver infantry, but infantry alone couldn't overcome entrenched defenders with armour support. Capturing ports took weeks or months. Time defenders used to reinforce and counterattack. LSTs solved this problem by making the port unnecessary. By delivering armour directly to the beach, LSTs gave assault forces immediate combined arms capability. Infantry, tanks, and artillery together from day one, not week 3 after the port finally fell. The ramp modification made this faster and safer. Not dramatically faster, not overwhelmingly safer. Just incrementally better, which across hundreds of ships and thousands of missions accumulated into a significant strategic advantage. Wars are won by such accumulations. The side that consistently performs 5% better across every dimension of warfare eventually overwhelms opponents who match them in individual engagements, but lose the aggregate competition. The welders at Dravo and Chicago Bridge and Iron probably never thought about strategic implications. They thought about seams that wouldn't crack, joints that would distribute stress properly, and construction schedules that couldn't afford delays. They welded ramps because the design specified ramps. The design specified ramps because someone observed that elevators were too slow. That observation reached designers because the Navy had created feedback mechanisms connecting combat operations to manufacturing processes. That systemic competence, more than any individual innovation, explains American industrial dominance during World War II. The ability to observe, adapt, and improve continuously while maintaining massive-scale production. Germany built the Tiger tank, superior to any American tank in direct combat. But Germany couldn't build enough Tigers to matter. America built 50,000 Shermans, individually inferior but collectively overwhelming, and America delivered those Shermans to the battlefield faster, using LSTs that unloaded in minutes instead of hours. The true illegal trick of the title, if one existed, was not a specific welding technique or design modification. It was the entire American industrial system's ability to scale production while improving quality. Shipyards that had never built warships, learning to construct complex vessels in months. Workers who had never welded learning to create seams, strong enough for repeated beach groundings. Engineers incorporating combat feedback into designs while maintaining production schedules that seemed impossible by pre-war standards. That system produced 1,051 LSTs in 4 years, produced them fast enough that several hundred were available for D-Day, 18 months after the first combat use in Sicily, produced them well enough that 96% survived the war despite operating in conditions more hazardous than any other major warship class faced, and produced them flexibly enough that modifications like the ramp could be incorporated rapidly without disrupting overall production. The title promises that one welder's illegal seam trick made LSTs unload 30 tanks in 12 minutes instead of hours. The reality is more complex and more remarkable. Thousands of welders at 5 inland shipyards created a manufacturing system that could build ships in days, modify them based on combat experience, and sustain production at scales that determined the strategic outcome of the war. The ramp modification was one of 3,000 improvements implemented during the war, most contributed by workers rather than engineers. 3,000 improvements that collectively saved $45 million and 31 million labor hours across all naval construction programs. The ramp probably saved a few thousand hours across the LST program specifically, but more importantly, it saved lives. Every minute of reduced exposure on a hostile beach was a minute fewer for artillery to find range, for mortars to adjust fire, for enemy machine guns to engage a stationary target. How many lives? Impossible to calculate. Some LSTs unloaded under fire and took casualties regardless of their ramp configuration. Some unloaded on secured beaches where exposure time mattered less, but across hundreds of ships and thousands of missions, the aggregate effect of faster unloading was fewer casualties, faster logistics, and more successful operations. That's the real story. Not one dramatic innovation, but the systematic pursuit of marginal improvements that compound into decisive advantages. Return one final time to the morning of November 7th, 1943, LST 513. The first ship with the welded ramp modification. Lieutenant Commander Walsh watches the last tank roll off his ship in 13 minutes total. Empress Augusta Bay, Bougainville. Marines are already advancing inland with armor support that arrived not 90 minutes after beaching, but 13 minutes after beaching. That 77-minute difference might mean the difference between repelling a Japanese counterattack and getting overrun before defensive positions can be established. Walsh doesn't know if his faster unload saved lives that specific morning. He knows it created margin, gave his Marines more time, more capability, more flexibility. And in war, margins compound. Small advantages in equipment, training, logistics, and tactics aggregate into overwhelming superiority even when individual engagements are close. The welded ramp that made Walsh's fast unload possible still exists. Aboard LST 325 in Evansville, Indiana, preserved as a museum ship, visitors can walk down that ramp, touch the steel, see the welds that joined the sections. The ship is silent now. No engines rumbling, no tanks rolling, no combat. Just a memorial to what American industry accomplished when pushed to its absolute limit. 2 museum ships remain from the entire LST program. 2 vessels out of 1,051, less than 0.2% survival rate. The ships are gone. But what they achieved remains. Every modern amphibious vessel incorporates lessons from LST operations. Every welded ship construction benefits from techniques pioneered at Dravo and Chicago Bridge and Iron. Every rapid military production program studies the LST program's success at scaling from 0 to over in 1,000 ships in under 4 years. The legacy is not steel. The legacy is knowledge. Knowledge purchased at the cost of 39 LSTs lost to enemy action, weather, and accidents during the war. Knowledge purchased with the lives of crews who sailed ships that were called large, slow targets for good reason. Knowledge that those crews were willing to pay that price because the alternative was losing the war. The morning of November 7th, 1943, 4 days after LST 513 was commissioned, the ship completed its first combat unload in 13 minutes. Proof that the ramp modification worked. Proof that American shipbuilders could innovate under pressure. Proof that welders at inland shipyards who had never seen an ocean could build vessels that would help win history's largest war. Not because of one illegal trick, because of 3,000 legal improvements implemented by workers who refused to accept that faster was impossible. Because Dravo invented better fabrication techniques and taught them to 4 other yards. Because Chicago Bridge and Iron's welding expertise translated from pressure tanks to ship hulls. Because Gary Thompson invented a tool to hold steel plates together and saved 5,000 man-hours per ship, multiplied across hundreds of ships. Because the ramp replaced the elevator and cut unloading time by 75% for main deck vehicles. The title promised 12 minutes instead of hours. The reality, 13 minutes instead of 90 minutes for LST 513's first combat unload. Less dramatic but more important because it was sustainable, repeatable, and multiplied across thousands of missions. That is the story. Not hyperbole, just history properly understood. The welders who built the ramp at Chicago Bridge and Iron in Seneca, Illinois, in July 1943, probably never learned that their work saved lives. Probably never knew that the seams they welded would bear armor across hostile beaches 240 times. Probably never understood that their particular expertise welding skills developed building pressure tanks would prove essential to winning the Pacific War. But it did, and that matters. Because wars are not won by generals and admirals alone. They are won by workers who weld straight seams at midnight in a shipyard in Illinois. By engineers who observe problems and suggest solutions. By crews who implement those solutions under fire. By systems that allow improvements to propagate from the factory floor to the front line faster than enemies can adapt. The LST ramp is proof that innovation in wartime comes not from laboratories, but from the accumulated wisdom of people who see problems firsthand. That the path from observation to implementation to validation to fleet-wide adoption can be measured in months, not years. That marginal improvements matter, that welding expertise matters, that every detail of design and construction compounds into strategic outcomes that determine who wins and who loses. Walk aboard LST 325 today in Evansville. Stand on the main deck. Look down at the ramp descending to the tank deck below. That ramp, and thousands like it welded into hundreds of LSTs, changed how wars are fought. Not dramatically. Just incrementally, consistently, decisively. The way most important changes actually occur. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.